it actually ushers us into that interview now, and I'm joined by Betty Kibara, who is an associate of Rockefeller. Many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
To my extreme left, you have Professor Willie Sowino. He's a post-harvest loss expert as well as a lecturer at JKUAT University. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, Kenya is looking forward to this particular forum, but the bigger question has been post-harvest losses have been a common story we've been hearing over and over. Perhaps if we could start with you, Betty, why now for this conference?
Why now for this conference? This is a good question because as you have seen from the budget reading, the proposed budget, the allocation of agriculture is not, it's not to the level that it should be. But even to think about that agricultural component, only about 4% actually in Africa goes towards the post-harvest loss, and whether it's technologies or solutions. And post-harvest loss is a big problem in Africa, and it causes loss for up to about 40 to 50% of whatever farmers produce is actually wasted. It never gets to the table. So I think what we are trying to do is that the focus has been so much on production, but we see it as a leaky bucket where you're putting in inputs. The government is investing, for example, with on fertilizers and inputs, and when the harvest comes, the crop is gone. And basically part of it is because it could be lack of market is one problem, lack of awareness of existing technologies for reducing loss, and access to finance are one of some of the major causes of food loss.
Interesting number you threw there, 40%. Professor, of course, coming from an academic background, we have the knowledge that we do have, we lose close to half of what we harvest. So from where you sit, what are some of the most exposed crops, and what are the statistics really looking like?
Well, when it comes to statistics on food losses, you find that in most African countries, we basically use estimates. And this is because since there is not so much, let's say, concern that have been given to post-harvest in the past, we really don't even have studies. So you find that even these figures that we have of 40, 50%, most of them are estimates that are kind of an average from various countries. But it's very hard for us to have specific studies showing that, for instance, maize will lose this much. But we can just estimate that, for instance, in perishable commodities like fruits and vegetables, it ranges between 40 and 60. And when it comes to grains, then we find that the figures given is between 30 and 40. So you find that really these are basically more or less estimates depending on the specific commodity.
And Betty, looking at this sad state of affairs, if you're saying 40% is what we'll lose, if I also translate that into money terms, I mean, it's quite a substantial amount running into the billions of shillings. And do you feel as a continent we've been able to invest in the right technology to mitigate against post-harvest losses, or where is the bucket leaking from?
Before I answer your question, I think I just want to add something that the professor has said. Under the Yieldwise initiative, which is reducing loss by 50%, which is an initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation, we have actually begun to carry out baseline studies. And for example, our most recent study in Nigeria shows that actually 50% of the tomatoes are actually lost. And now to your second question around the technologies. Actually, we spent a couple of months doing a lot of research work, and technologies actually do exist. For example, if I take an example of maize, we have technologies such as hermetic bags or airtight bags, which actually cost only $2. But if you go to the village, farmers don't even know that such bags exist. They just use the regular bags, which, where maize is stored in about 2-3 months, it's eaten up by weevils. So technologies actually exist in Africa and also globally. We are trying to work to bring some of them in Africa. For example, the cold storage units. Nowadays, you can store your mangoes under solar unit, and the farmers can aggregate and wait for prices to become better. There are also emerging technologies on drying. For example, mangoes technology. If you go to the hub today, you buy a kilo of dried mangoes at 1,000 shillings. And while the same, if you buy fresh, it's about 100 shillings. So technologies actually exist, but it's more of raising awareness. And one of the things we have been focusing on in this initiative is to raise awareness by aggregating farmers and training them on how best they can use some of those technologies. Yeah, but I think to the question then is the whole of the financing component. For example, a cold storage unit for mangoes or for vegetables, it would cost about $3,000. But how many farmers or aggregated group of farmers in, for example, Makueni or Malindi are able to get that kind of money? So I think is the financing piece, farmers and aggregated group of farmers being able to source for that financing. And the cost of financing, in this country is pretty high. So those are some of the comments here.
And Prof, of course, being at JQuat, you've been at the forefront of trying to come up with research and studies that can be able to be used by the agricultural agencies in terms of formulating their policy. And if you were to look back and say, okay, now that we are going into this post-harvest forum, what are some of the teething issues that you feel there are lacunas, if I would say so, in the policy side of things?
Well, as Betty has said, we find, for instance, there are some technologies which have been proven to work, but we find that, for instance, their adoption rate within our country is very low. So we find that it's then behoves the government to come up with a policy that says that, for instance, when it comes to maize, from now on, we'll be using hermetic storage. So we find that that's a policy that must be enforced by a government agency. But we find that if you leave it to the farmers to decide, then they'll say that, oh, this thing is $2. Well, I can use a cheaper bag. But we find that these are some of the things that then will contribute to the loss.
So do you have jurisdictions where we can borrow a leaf from countries that have been able to walk that path and they've been able to reduce the losses we incur?
Well, we find that countries like, for instance, South Africa and most of the developed world, then they have policies that kind of now outlines that once a produce is harvested, these are some of the ways that it's supposed to be handled, or this is not the way it's supposed to be handled. So you find that these policies do exist in other parts of the world.
You seem like you wanted to chip in as well.
Yeah, I actually wanted to give an example of Senegal. I was most recently in Senegal, and in Senegal, the way they have structured their tomato value chain, it's interesting because there is separation of the tomato for fresh market and for processing. So where the government came in 40 years ago and said, this region of the country, we're going to only focus on, we are going to zone this, and it's only for tomatoes. And bringing all the stakeholders, all the partners, the farmers, the processors. Actually, they have 3 processors. And you find a country like Senegal, when you look at the tomato value chain for the processed tomatoes, the losses are actually quite low because also of processing. The fact that you don't have to sell all the tomatoes to the market, but you can process for a later use. So we have examples, but I can say in Africa, this is one of the areas we are trying to focus on, trying to look at, to support and look at some of those countries which have coming up with interesting policies on food loss. And I can give an example of Tanzania. Tanzania right now is working on its policy on post-harvest loss solutions, and we are also trying to provide some input on the policies. But I think that's one area that we need to improve, policies on post-harvest loss.
Of course, policy remains a hot issue, really. And moving on, Prof, right now, if you're to go to the market, let's say in a place like Siaya, people have harvested, they're trying to sell their produce. They can't get markets. So eventually, whatever they've produced, they either sell it at a cheaper price or it rots in their houses. So where is the mismatch? At the same time, the people in the manufacturing side are saying there's not enough supply. We're even having maybe to import to plug in the shortfall.
Well, we find that usually, as you say, there's usually this mismatch whereby processors say that they can't get enough. While on the other hand, we find that farmers are losing quite a lot. You find that a processor needs volumes. He needs quantity. For instance, as you said, if I have a produce which I have to a processor, let's say based in Nairobi, I have to go to Siaya to collect. You see, I need quantity.
Sure.
For instance, I need a truck.
Yeah, the economies of scale.
Exactly. So you find that if, for instance, farmers in Siaya, you find that only a few will grow small quantities here and there, such that it's not economical for that good produce to reach the market. So one of the things that can be done is that if we can aggregate farmers to get enough volumes that will satisfy the processor. You
Are
find
they
that
ready to be aggregated? Or
Well,
the
those are some of
middlemen
the
will
initiatives
scuttle
that-
this?
Yeah, I think you ask, thanks, Prof. I think you asked a good question. Are they ready to be aggregated? And this gives me an opportunity to just briefly share with you what the Yieldwise initiative is all about. It's a $130 million initiative to be invested in several countries, and it's aimed at reducing post-harvest loss by 50%. And we have started working in 3 countries, in Nigeria, the cassava value chain and the tomato value chain. In Kenya, we're working with 20,000 mango farmers, and in Tanzania, we're already working with about 50,000 farmers.
All right.
We look at 4 components that are going to help us reduce loss. One is access to market, the exact same question that you've asked. The second one is around aggregating farmers and training them to produce what the buyer is looking for, because sometimes farmers just produce for, a strategy of hope that will produce and get a buyer.
And subsistence,
Yeah,
of course.
and then 2 other components which are very important is the post-harvest technology and the finance that I talked about. So back to your question, are they ready to be aggregated? Under the Yieldwise initiative, in the last 1 year, we have aggregated more than about 50,000 farmers. And how this works is that farmers get into forward contracts with buyers.
Yeah.
Buyers like Dangote Farms Limited in Nigeria, who is sourcing for tomatoes for processing. And they agree on a quality. This is the quality that I want, and then the farmers are able to provide that quality. So aggregation is taking place, and farmers are adopting technologies. I think that's just a good example that, with some of these demonstrations, they can also be replicated in other places.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, interesting conversation there. Of course, we can't exhaust it in one sitting,
Yeah.
and we'll definitely be making time to invite you again for another round of insights into this issue that continues to befall the country. That is, of course, post-harvest losses, where the country loses quite a substantial amount out of this. And there'll be that post-harvest forum that will be happening in Nairobi. And if you can, do make an effort to take part. Well, let me wrap up with a look at our Twitter poll. Today we're asking you, have we invested enough in creating knowledge and technology to manage post-harvest losses? Have we invested enough in this particular area? Well, I can see the results are in very interesting numbers. 68% are saying, no, we have not invested enough in technology and knowledge, whereas we are seeing about 12% saying they don't know whether we've invested or not, and another 22% are saying that yes, we've invested enough. Actually, 11%, let me take the numbers again. I've just refreshed my Twitter handle, and 72% are saying no, we've not invested enough. 11% yes, 17% no. So a lot of work to be done, ladies and gentlemen, and of course to the various agencies that continue to handle this issue of post-harvest losses. Well, it has been a pleasure bringing to you this episode of KTN Business Today. Let's do this again tomorrow, same time, same place, and enjoy the rest of your viewing. Coming up next is Worldview. My name is Abi Agina.